So up to this point, we've looked at solving quadratic equations by completing the square where the leading coefficient was equal to 1. Now we're going to look at it when it's not equal to 1. So an example of this might be 2x squared plus 3x minus 7 equal to 0. Notice this is not factorable, so we cannot factor it to solve it. We're going to complete the square. Remember, the first step in completing the square is to move the constant term to the right side. We're going to do that by adding 7 to both sides. So we get 2x squared plus 3x equal to 7. The next thing we're going to do is divide this 2 out of each of our terms. So we get x squared plus 3 halves x equal to 7 halves. Notice our leading coefficient is now 1. We can complete the process just like we did when the leading coefficient was not or was equal to 1. So we're going to take that 3 halves off to the side. We're going to divide it by 2, and then we're going to square it. 3 halves divided by 2 is 3/4. And we're going to square. 3/4 squared is equal to 9/16. So we're going to add 9/16 to both sides of our equation. Factoring this, if you remember, factors fairly easily because we have that term, that constant term, already figured out for us. It's going to be 3/4 squared. So our only true math is over here. We need a common denominator between 2 and 16, which is 16. So we're going to multiply this by 8 over 8. And we end up with 56/16 plus 9/16. 56 and 9 gives us 65/16. Finishing, to solve for x, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we get x plus 3/4 equals plus or minus the square root of 65 over 4. We're going to solve for x by subtracting 3/4. And we end up with x equals negative 3/4 plus or minus the square root of 65 over 4. Notice our denominators are the same again, so we can go ahead and combine this and say x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 65 over 4. And that's our final answer, since 65 is not reducible. If it were reducible, we would go ahead and reduce it. Example 2. Let's keep it the same, but this time let's look at one that would be factorable and one that we can simplify a little bit. So let's look at 3x squared minus 11x minus 4 equal to 0. Again, this one is factorable. However, if we didn't realize it was factorable, what would it look like in completing the square? So we're going to add 4 to both sides. We have that leading coefficient, so we're going to divide it by 3. So we get x squared minus 11x over 3 equals 4/3. We're going to take that 11/3 and we're going to divide it by 2 and square it. 11/3 divided by 2 is the same as 11/6. The quick way of doing that is to multiply the two denominators. So the denominator of the top and the denominator of the whole thing. Squared. Negative 11 squared is 121. And 6 squared is 36. So we're going to add 121/36 to both sides. We're going to factor this left side since we know that it factors x minus 11/6. Over here, we're going to combine these two. 3 and 36 has a common denominator of 36, so I'm going to multiply it by 12. So I end up with 48 over 36 plus my 121 over 36. And that gives us 169 over 36. Take the square root of both sides. So we have x minus 11 over 6 equals plus or minus 13 over 6. Square root of 169 is 13. Square root of 36 is 6. Add 11/6 to both sides. So we get x equals 11/6 plus or minus 13/6. Notice my two denominators are the same again. So I can combine my top, and I get x equals 11 plus 13 over 6. And I'm going to go ahead and break this up into 11 minus 13 over 6, since I have that plus or minus sign in there. 11 plus 13 is 24, divided by 6 gives me 4. 11 minus 13 is negative 2, divided by 6 is negative 1/3. And there are my two solutions. And for good measure, let's look at one more example. Let's take example 3 as being 2x squared minus 3x plus 4 equals 0. Notice we have a leading coefficient not equal to 1. So we're going to move this 4 over. Gives us a negative 4. We're going to divide by 2. So we get x squared minus 3/2 x equals negative 2. Take our negative 3/2. We're going to divide it by 2. And we're going to square it. So we end up with negative 3/4 squared. Remember, multiply your 2 and your 2. Gives us negative 3/4. Squaring it, we get 9/16. So we're going to add 9/16 to both sides. Factoring this, we have x minus 3/4 squared. And we're going to set that equal to, here our common denominator, we make negative 2 over 1. So we get a common denominator of 16. So this is negative 32/16 plus 9/16. Negative 32 plus 9 is negative 23/16. Go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And we see that x minus 3/4 equals negative, the square root of negative 23 over the square root of 16 is 4. And we have our plus or minus sign. Go ahead and add 3/4 to both sides. So we have x equals 3/4 plus or minus the square root of negative 23 over 4. We have a common denominator already, so we can combine this to 3 plus or minus I radical 23 over 4. You may ask yourself, where did that I come from? Remember, when we have the square root of a negative number, we can bring it out to the outside of our radical as an I. So we now have two complex numbers for this solution. And there's our answer. And that concludes our completing the square with a leading coefficient not 1.